So there is a great Buddhist text, and one that got me studying Buddhism and got me to be a student of the Mahayana practice for a long time. And even though I have been more drawn to church and I have been more following Jesus, I would say, as an icon, specifically through A Course in Miracles, I have found a lot of the sayings of the Diamond Sutra to apply directly to the practical, mystical Christian in today's life, so especially the universalist Quaker among us. So I'm going to look at the 6 paramitas of the Diamond Sutra, and I'm going to compare them with direct quotes from the online edition of A Course in Miracles, next here on Jinka Jabo. The first paramita, that is the crossing of the river, the first of 6, the Dana paramita, is the practice of charity, and we will get back to the term charity at the very end. But Subhuti, one of Tathagata, the Sakyamuni, Siddhartha Gautama Buddha, asked him about the atoms of dust in the universe, and on all of the universes. But Tathagata speaks of atoms of dust. It does not mean that he has in mind any definite or arbitrary conception. He merely uses the words as a figure of speech. It is just the same with the words. The great universes, they do not assert any definite or arbitrary idea. He merely uses the words as words. And this, of course, reminds me of the Course in Miracles, which says, regarding words, God does not understand words, for they were made by separated minds to keep them in the illusion of separation. And this references, in the Christian language of A Course in Miracles, of course, the story of Babel, the tower where everyone tried to reach God from land, and everyone got separated by different tongue. But it goes deeper than that. As someone who has studied language, I must say that it speaks to the fact that no matter what word we use to define something, the use of the word itself has a diminishing effect, and it somehow enables us to pass judgment on other things, and it makes us lesser than who we really are. And for me, that's the first lesson, the first paramita, the practice of charity. We can get through the second lesson, the second paramita, the sila paramita, the practice of selfless kindness. We can get through it quite quickly, because it has a very simple message and one that resonates with all of the Diamond Sutra, as well as with all of A Course in Miracles. I quote, "Remember, there is no arbitrary distinction between one's own self and the selfhood of others, and, therefore, you should practice charity by giving, not objective gifts alone, but the selfless gifts of kindness and sympathy." There are many uses of the word kindness in A Course in Miracles, but the one that I referred to, the one that I hope to quote here, is that kindness created me kind, which is a very simple statement, but it is the truth. If we consider that God, if we consider the source of all creation, the source of all consciousness, as being itself kind, then we must be an expression of kindness through the Yahweh, through the Tathagata, through the expression of the Word and the Spirit of all creation. In the third paramita, the paramita of rebirth, we find something that speaks for the Mahayana tradition, as well as, of course, offshoots like the Zen tradition, the Pure Land traditions, something that I think is really amazing, this concept of Satori, this concept which draws me back, this idea of there being no actual rebirth. And this goes against Theravada traditions and other traditions in Buddhism, which we'll get into at some point later. But the fact is, in the Diamond Sutra it says, I quote, "Speaking truly, there will be no rebirth either in this world or in any other world." And in this, the Buddha, the Tathagata, is explaining to his disciples that when you finally reach the other side, when you finally cross the river, when you finally make it across that paramita, then you will actually not need to be reborn anymore, and any life that you had before will not matter, because you will be enveloped completely in love. In A Course in Miracles it says, rebirth itself is merely the dawning of your mind of what is already in it, which completely jives with the Diamond Sutra and this idea that you've already got it inside of you, and that it's just waiting to be dawned, and it can happen in an instant, and there is no such thing as rebirth or waiting to be reborn as someone who's closer to a Buddha. The Course also says, all the arbitrary names the world bestows can be withdrawn as they are raised to doubt. And it's kind of hard to understand that unless you read the entire course and study the lessons, because what it means, as someone in my limited capacity to speak on this subject, but at least as someone who has completed the course, I can say that it means that it's talking about this special self, the ego. It's talking about the different types of persons and how we assign names to them. And a name is just the first of hundreds and sometimes thousands of labels that we put on people, conditionally or unconditionally. The way they treat us well, we give them a judgment. The way they treat us poorly, we give them a judgment. In any sense, we are separating them from ourselves, and this is not really the spirit of rebirth, and it is not the spirit of humility and patience, which is the third paramita. Alright, so the fourth paramita is the practice of zeal and perseverance. And it's the most important to me of the six because it talks about angels. And I think maybe this is a bit silly to admit, but I do believe in angels, and it's amazing how the same concept of angels expressed here in the Diamond Sutra is the representation of angels that you would find in the New Testament or even in the Quran. And so I think that gives credence to this idea of celestial beings, figures of God walking among people on earth to help us understand. So we've already gone through a bit of the sutra, the Diamond Sutra, and by the time we get to the practice of zeal and the Virya Paramita, the practice of zeal and perseverance, we are introduced to the concept of angels as people who have blessed the place wherever this sutra is understood. And the sutra, the Diamond Sutra, I would argue, is in its full extent a long rendition of the Golden Rule. And here in the very end of this paramita we find, quote, "Wherever the scripture shall be observed and studied and explained, that place will become sacred ground to which countless devas and angels will bring offerings. Such places, however humble they may be, will be reverenced as though they were famous temples and pagodas to which countless pilgrims will come to offer worship and incense. And over them the devas and angels will hover like a cloud, and will sprinkle upon them an offering of celestial flowers." And here we see in that reading of the Diamond Sutra, and whatever translation you take, evidence of angels in Buddhism. And so I looked up angels in A Course in Miracles, and there are many references, but here's the one that I wrote down. "You do not walk alone. God's angels hover near and all about." And I know there are references to angels in the Bible that talk of them being near us, but here is just more confirmation. You find that in all the great spiritual teachings, all the great spiritual writings, we see evidence of angels, and that is one thing that I love about the Diamond Sutra. So now we're to our fifth paramita, the practice of tranquility, and it is the dhyana paramita. And dhyana, for those who have studied Buddhism, will know that it is a word for the practice of, in Chinese and Taoism, the wu wei, the sitting still and doing nothing. The practice of tranquility. And I reread it for this video after many years of not really looking at it, and I came to this very end of the chapter. I quote, "Because all the mind's arbitrary conceptions of matter, phenomena, and of all conditioning factors and all conceptions and ideas relating thereto are like a dream, a phantasm, a bubble, a shadow, the evanescent dew, the lightning's flash, every true disciple should thus look upon all phenomena and upon all the activities of the mind and keep his mind empty and selfless and tranquil." And here is the only example of the six where I didn't have to look up a word in A Course in Miracles, where I knew exactly where to go right away. And that was to lesson 1, which goes, "Nothing I see means anything," which is a very heavy idea, and I'm surprised looking back that they give it to you right away. But it's something that gets repeated on and on throughout the course. It's this idea that you cannot trust your five senses, and it reminds me of in the New Testament when Jesus says you already have five husbands. There are those of us who study metaphysical Christianity who say that he is really speaking of this woman's five senses. Anyway, nothing I see means anything. It even goes back to Ecclesiastes if you want some real good existential Christian reading to guide you on your spiritual path. That is tranquility, Paramita 5. Now this was a bit harder for me to connect, but in the final Paramita, the Paramita of wisdom, we look at being, the idea of being, and this is something that follows through all of the Diamond Sutra. Quote, "Why do you still hold within your mind such arbitrary conceptions? There are no such things as sentient beings, neither are there any non-sentient beings." And why, Subhuti? Because you have in mind that sentient beings are unreal, because what you have in mind as sentient beings are unreal and non-existent. When the Tathagata has used such words in his teachings, he has merely used them as figures of speech. Your question, therefore, is irrelevant. And it is here that Tathagata is rebuking Subhuti, who is trying to find evidence for individual persons in this concept of the, the Dharma that they are experiencing. Not the Dharma, the samsara. The samsara that he is experiencing on this edge, on the other side of the river. Regarding being, A Course in Miracles says, I quote, "God, who encompasses all being, created beings who have everything individually, but who want to share it to increase their joy. Nothing real can be increased except by sharing. That is why God created you." That is why God created you. Thus, our whole purpose for being here is to share joy and to create more joy. That's a very positive message, I should say. Anyway, that is the connection I found between the Diamond Sutra and A Course in Miracles on the 6th Paramita of wisdom. Finally, we go back to this idea of charity, and for me as someone who just completed the course and I'm meditating on it, I think that there are two very difficult things to understand about the Course. The first is that we must take control over our own lives. We must realize that we can make our own decisions. And secondly, having that power, we must devote time to helping others. And that's a very hard thing for anyone, especially people who feel like they aren't getting enough out of life, especially for people who are struggling to get to a point where they feel that they belong. And so we must go back to the idea of charity, which was the first paramita, but the practice of charity, the dana paramita. But also charity is referenced in the conclusion of Goddard's Diamond Sutra. So let's read from that. "There will be those who, practicing charity and keeping the precepts, will believe in sections and sentences of the scripture and will awaken within their minds a true, pure faith." Okay. And there, that is proof, just as the New Testament or the Quran gives proof of certain automatic passes into heaven in certain cases. Here it is in the Diamond Sutra being explained, that those who completely understand themselves as owing everything to everyone else and being completely charitable are those who will find either the Pure Land or heaven, or however we define it, that immortal place where virtue lives forever. And in the conclusion regarding charity, the Course in Miracles says, "Healing rests on charity, and charity is a way of perceiving the perfection of another, even if you cannot perceive it in yourself." And that's one of the hardest and one of the most beautiful disciplines, conclusions of A Course in Miracles, and what matches here with the Diamond Sutra. This beautiful idea that once you begin to forgive others completely for their actions, then you are able to free yourself. Then you are able to bring love and justice and beauty to the world around you. Thank you so much for listening to Jinka Jabo. Peace.